So very good to be back with you all this afternoon. I'm going to encourage everybody at this time to take out a Bible and open them up to Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21. We have, let me say it this way. It's been a while since we have engaged in, or continued our series of lessons on lessons from the life of our Lord, going chronologically through the life of Jesus. We have about, 3-4 years ago, we started doing this. We started looking at what does the Bible, or just looking at the Bible account, looking at the life of Jesus, going chronologically from his birth into even his, as we'll get to, Lord willing, and whenever we get there, to his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. And right now, we pick up back where we originally, or where we left off last time. It is the last week of Jesus' life, here before his crucifixion. And he had just spent the last couple of days there in the temple, area, talking to people. He had been talking to, in particular, either this day or the day before, depending on how you judge what day this was, whether it was late on Tuesday or on Wednesday. Guess it doesn't really matter when Luke 21 happens. But he had spent all day talking to the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of these people, and they're asking him all of these questions, trying to trap him. And he's just gone through the entire day answering those questions. And in chapter 23 of the book of Matthew, we see that he spent a great portion of that day condemning the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and all of the chief priests and religious leaders for the neglect that they had given to God's word and focusing on preparing the people for the coming Messiah, for him to come. And at the end of Matthew chapter 23, we read this. I'll just read it for you. In verse 37, 38, and 39. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This happens at the end of the day. And as Jesus was doing that week, at the end of the day, since he was not staying there in Jerusalem, he started to leave. And we see that as he is leaving, that statement that your house will be left to you desolate really made people, at least his disciples, what's he talking about? Surely he doesn't mean the temple. And you see this in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 24. And you see this in Mark's account, Mark 13. And we see this here in Luke chapter 21. And in verse 5, that as they are leaving, some of the disciples, as they spoke of the temple, they said, look how beautiful it is. Look how adorned it is with great stones and donations. And it's absolutely beautiful. Almost as if to say, Jesus, you think, surely you can't be talking about the temple being desolate, being left to us desolate. Surely you can't be meaning that. You got to be meaning something else. So they're saying, look how beautiful the temple is. And certainly you look at accounts that are given of, or descriptions of the temple in that time. It certainly was a magnificent edifice, a magnificent building. And certainly a lot of ancient writers spoke about it. Josephus in particular. And Jesus simply responds to him there in verse 6. These things which you see, talking about the temple and talking about the just how the splendor of it all, how magnificent it seems. These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. They get a little way out of the city. They come to the Mount of Olives on their way back to Bethany. And they stop and they ask him. Matter of fact, put all the accounts together, you see that it's Peter, Andrew, James, and John that stop Jesus and say, what do you mean by that? They ask him, Teacher, when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? And this is what I'd like for us to talk about tonight. I'd like for us to spend some time talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or rather of the temple itself. And the reason why we do this is because so many people have come up with fantastical ideas and about what these verses mean. And they seem to want to apply them to things that have not yet happened. That, this is talking about something in the future. That this is all going to happen when Jesus comes back and he establishes an earthly kingdom here on earth, there in Jerusalem. And there's going to need to be a temple there for that to happen. All of these things are going to need to happen. We call this premillennialism. And it is a false doctrine. And yet it is something that so many people believe. Matter of fact, I guarantee that many of your friends and your family members believe in premillennialism. They believe falsely or falsehoods about this particular teaching of Jesus that he gives here in Matthew chapter 24, in Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. And I will tell you that what we find here in Luke chapter 21 and verses 5 through 36, it is talking about not the coming of Jesus, his second coming, but it is talking about the destruction of the temple there in Jerusalem in AD 70. And the same thing is found in Matthew chapter 24, which is probably a more familiar passage to us, which is why I chose to look at Luke 21 this evening. But there in Matthew chapter 24, in verses 4 through 36, Jesus is, or at least 4 through 35, is talking about the destruction of the temple. And I want us to all be clear about this. I want us to all be able to talk to our friends and our family members who believe falsely about this. I want us to be able to tell them the truth and show them from Scripture what the truth is. And so with that said, let's go ahead and let's look at this. And let's just notice what Jesus did say about all of this. What did he actually say in these verses? Let's go ahead and turn back there to Luke chapter 21. And let's start there in verse 8 when Jesus responds. And let's read on down through at least verse 24. And we'll pick up the rest later on. But starting in verse 8, Jesus said, after he was asked, when will these things be, being the destruction of the temple? What sign will there be when these things are about to take place? Essentially the same question. And Jesus said, take heed that you not be deceived. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time has drawn near. But therefore, do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and of commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first. But the end will not come immediately. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. But before all of these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. And you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience possess your souls. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. And let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, or that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, let's just stop right there. And let's talk about some of these things. What did Jesus say? And we can look at the other accounts, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and they all say essentially the same thing. Almost exactly the same thing a lot of the time. What is said? The first thing that he says is that these things would happen in this generation. We didn't actually read that in verse 32. If you read this in verse 32, he said, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place." This point is made not just in Luke's account, but also in Matthew's account. In Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 34, it says, "This generation will not die before these things happen." Mark 13 and verse 30 says exactly the same thing. This generation. My friends, we have to be absolutely clear about this. That these things, Jesus says, these things that I'm telling you about, all the things that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, over the next few minutes, they're all going to happen in this generation, before this generation dies. And as I've said so many times, unless we've got 2,000-year-old Jews walking around, these things cannot apply to anything that is going on today or in the future, or really anything that's happened in the last 1900 and something years. It was something that would happen within a generation, within 40-year period. That's about the time of a generation, according to a lot of scholars and commentaries and so many things. And if this was said in 33 AD, it would have to be before 40 years, before 73 AD. That's some good math. Okay. Not anything after that. Of course, that's a rough number, but still. We need to keep that in mind. So the destruction of Jerusalem was going to happen. All of these events were going to happen within 40 years. Now, Jesus tells them, okay, that's the time frame within this generation, within 40 years. It's going to happen. But he also tells them this, that there would be what are called false signs. And certainly we see this in Matthew's account, maybe more prominently. But we see this as well here in in Luke's account. He says that there are going to be some false Christs. There in Matthew's account, it comes out and just says it. Jesus comes out and says it. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. Or people will come and say, hey, the Christ is over here. Don't pay any attention to him. Don't pay any attention to it. There in Matthew 24, verses 23 through 26. That's not the Christ. There are going to be people that are going to come and say, I'm the Christ, or I saw the Christ over there. Nope. That is a false sign. Those people are not telling the truth. There would be other false signs like wars and rumors of wars. There would be famines and pestilences and earthquakes. There would be persecution of the faithful. And we read that Luke 21. We read all of this Luke 21. Especially there in verses 12 through 19, talking about the persecution of the faithful for preaching the gospel in all of the nations and all of the world. And that there would be, Matthew 24 and verse 14, the preaching of the gospel across the world, worldwide. All of these things were going to happen before the destruction of the temple. But these things would not be signs that the coming destruction of the destruction of the temple would be immediate. Okay? We understand this. We understand when it gets nighttime. We understand the signs that, oh, it's getting dark outside. It's getting late. Because the birds stop chirping and then the crickets come out and they're doing their business. And then the sun gets darker and just all sorts of crazy things going on. You can tell I don't spend a lot of time outside, right? Okay. But we understand this. Jesus says that's what these things are. These are things that are going to happen. And friends, let me just say this as well. When in the last 2,000 years have these things not been happening? When have there not been people come out and say, I am the Christ, follow me? Yeah, that happens all the time. You get online, there's 1,000 nutters that you can find. I probably shouldn't say it that way. But 1,000 people that say, I'm the Christ. No, they're not. You hear about these wars and rumors of war. I remember talking with a woman that I was working with. We had some downtime and we were talking about things. And we were talking about what was going on after 9/11. We were talking about, oh, this is a sign of the apocalypse. This is a sign that Jesus, this is wars and rumors of war. It's like, have you actually read that passage? Let's sit down and let's read it together. Jesus said these things are not his coming. He says, do not be deceived. These things are not showing that he is coming immediately. And doesn't even apply to that. I blew her mind that night. But we see these things. When haven't there been famines and pestilences and earthquakes? There was an earthquake just a couple of days ago in Russia that was going to affect a lot of our west coast, from Alaska down to Mexico. There are earthquakes that are happening. So much. People being persecuted for preaching the gospel. We may look at our lives here and go, well, we're not really persecuted that much. Not here in America. You go to somewhere else where they're not as free, and absolutely, you go over and try and preach the gospel in China, some other place, North Korea. Yeah. Folks, these things, not immediate signs. Jesus said these things were going to happen, and to be clear, history tells us that these things did happen. There were people, Egyptian, there were several people that came claiming to be Christ after his death, burial, and resurrection. There were famines and civil wars and all sorts of things that were going on. And they're recorded for us in historical writings by Josephus and by Tacitus, the Roman historian, and several others. These things did happen. And they happened between this time period, 33 AD, when Jesus was crucified, and the 70 AD, within that generation. But these things, they would happen. But they were not going to be signs. And Jesus said, do not be deceived by these things. The end is not yet come. But he said that there would be signs. He gave two signs in particular. One sign that he gave was the abomination of desolations. The abomination of desolations. We read that there in Matthew chapter 24. There in Matthew chapter 24, we read that in verse 15, where he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and it goes on from there. Now, there's been a lot of confusion about what the abomination of desolation is. But apparently the Jews knew what it was, because Matthew says, you all know what this is. Everybody who reads this understands it. He says, this will be this abomination of desolation. When you see this, you know the time is come. And he says, get out. Get out. They were to run to the hills. They were, as we turn back there, they were to flee. They were to flee Judea, flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For this is a days of vengeance. Matthew's account says, don't even go back into the city. Don't go, if you're on the rooftop of your house and you see these things happening, don't even go into your house. Just take off and run with whatever you have. Don't waste any time. Run. And I hope that it's not on a Sabbath day or in the winter. Pray that it's not, Jesus says. And I feel bad. Woe to those who are nursing infants or pregnant when this happens. Now, friends, I want to take a moment and pause right here just to point this out. If this had anything to do with Jesus' second coming, if it had anything to do with the judgment, would it matter if it was in the winter or if it was on the Sabbath? Would it matter if somebody was pregnant or nursing? No. Obviously, if we just use our brains a little bit, we can understand that these things, they're not talking about something that is magnificent on a universal scale. Something that is on a local, finite scale, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, when they saw the abomination of desolation, when they saw the eagles, we didn't mention that, Matthew mentions the eagles there in Matthew chapter 24. There in Matthew 24 and verse 28, wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. These were the signs. When they saw this, Jesus' disciples, they were supposed to get out of town. They were supposed to run for the hills. Why? Because something was going to happen. The temple was going to be destroyed. Matter of fact, the destruction of the temple was just part of the destruction of Jerusalem. That Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. It was actually going to be besieged first. But it was going to be destroyed. And the time leading up to its actual destruction was going to be so horrific that it was like nothing ever before. The tribulation, Matthew 24 and verse 21, it will be so great, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor shall ever be. It was going to be a horrific event. Jesus did not want his followers to be in that mess. Get out while you can. He didn't want anybody to be in that mess. But especially not his followers. And Jesus says as well that all of this was going to be such an upheaval of the natural order of things that even the heavens themselves would be disturbed by all of this. There in Luke 21, in verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distresses of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. And for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The whole world, the whole system was going to be upset by what was going on with the destruction of the temple. Again, all of this is talking about the destruction of the temple. Jesus says these things were going to happen. Now, we ask ourselves the question, what actually did happen? What actually did happen? Well, we see that there were a lot of things that did happen. There were false Christs. There were earthquakes. Matter of fact, it was so unusual that there were so many earthquakes that so many historians thought it was the end of the world as they were recording it. They said this is unusual. There were wars and civil wars that are recorded for us. There were pestilences and violences and famines and all sorts of things that happened over the next 30 years. And then in about 60 AD, we see that Rome, the power of the world at that time, went to the Jews, said, Jews, we're tired of your nonsense. You need to start showing Caesar some respect. And so I want you all, if you're going to continue to offer your little sacrifices here in your temple, I'm paraphrasing, of course, you're going to need to offer some sacrifices in honor to Caesar as well. And the Jews at the time said, okay. This was the abomination of desolation. This is what Daniel was talking about in Daniel chapter 9. This is something that was hinted at with Antiochus Epiphanes IV in the intertestamental period, in between the Old Testament and New Testament, when he went into the temple and he offered pigs on the altar of the temple and defamed it. It was an abomination. And people were thinking that was the abomination of desolation. Jesus says, obviously that was not, but it's just like that. What is about to happen is what had previously happened about 200 years before. False sacrifices offered in the temple. Josephus tells us that, unfortunately, after about 5 years of this, that the Jews refused to do it anymore. There were some, according to Josephus, the historian, there were some villainous people with unwashed feet that went into the temple area where they were not allowed to go, took down, stopped the altar, stopped the sacrifices to Caesar, and really defiled it, the whole area. It was an abomination. And people said it was an abomination. People recognized this was abominable, what was happening. Because of this, Rome, as you can imagine, was not too happy. Because the Jews were rebelling against them again. And so, over the next few years, Rome sent army after army after army to besiege and destroy Jerusalem, to set things right. There were actually 3 sieges. It's very interesting how this happens. There is one where the Roman Empire, they are moving south towards Jerusalem, and they are almost to Jerusalem. And they inexplicably say, we're not going to bother with Jerusalem right now. We'll take care of some of the other places. And then they leave. The Christians, when they saw this, they remembered what Jesus said about Luke chapter 21. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Matthew's account uses the word eagles, where the carcass is. The eagle was the symbol of Rome. When they saw Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, get out. And that is exactly what they did. Christian historians like Eusebius tell us that not a single Christian was lost because of this. They recognized this prophecy being fulfilled right then. And they listened to the words of Jesus and they got out without delay. And if they missed it the first time, there was a second time when they came and they had besieged Jerusalem this time. And because the emperor died, they had to leave. Because there was a power struggle, they went back to Rome, and Titus said, or Vespasian said, I'm the emperor now. And when all of that was settled, they sent an army a third time with Titus, the Roman general, who would later become the emperor. Sent him to destroy Jerusalem. And folks, during these sieges, especially during the last siege, it was horrific. It was horrific. Over 1 million Jews died during that time period. They had nothing to eat for the last portion of it. They had resorted to eating leather and eating each other. So much fighting had been going on within the city walls. So much blood was shed that they were throwing the bodies unceremoniously over the wall. And it was disturbing the Romans who had seen everything. There was so much death, so much bloodshed. It was horrific. It was the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. I hope you never can imagine it. But it was terrible. It was horrific. And finally, it ended. In AD 70, the Romans destroyed the temple. They went in and they started killing just anybody that they found that were in the streets. They finally broke through the walls, broke through the gates. They were killing everybody. And there was so much bloodshed that Josephus reports to us that there was so much blood that the walls of the houses that they went into, they were so blood-soaked that they wouldn't even burn. They destroyed everything. They killed so many people. And when it came to the temple, the Jews had finally retreated back to the temple area. And they were saying, just give up Titus. did not want to give up, or did not want to destroy the temple. Josephus tells us that. He did not want to destroy the temple. But because of the stubbornness of the Jews, because they would not surrender, he said, tear it all down. Tear it all down. I don't want one stone left upon another. And that is exactly what they did. They fulfilled every single word of Jesus. All of this. Everything that Jesus said there in Luke chapter 21. Everything that Jesus said in Matthew 24 through verse 35. Everything happened just exactly the way that God said that it would. If you'd like to check my references on that, I encourage you to do that. I'll make copies of them, make them available to you. I've got a book of Josephus' writings. We'll tell you all about this, several other books that talk about this. But folks, this is what happened. Exactly what Jesus said was going to happen. It's all about the destruction of the temple, not what's going to happen thousands of years later. Now, in Matthew 24 and starting in verse 36, Jesus says we're going to talk about next Sunday. He does talk about the end of the world. But like I said, we'll talk about that next week. So with all that said, I want us to understand just a few things. And then we'll be done. What now? 4 things. 1, know and understand that Jesus was talking about the destruction of the temple. That's what Jesus was talking about. He was not talking about the second coming. They were not asking about the second coming of Jesus. Jesus answered their question. When will these things take place? What's going to be the sign that the temple is going to be left to us desolate? We need to know this and understand this for ourselves so that we can humbly go and help others understand this as well. My friends, so many people, they have this misunderstanding of Scripture. And we may say, Curtis, why does that matter? Why does it matter if they believe something that's false? Because Jesus wants us to know the truth and live by the truth. That's in itself enough. But I'll tell you this as well. That premillennialism, what so many people believe, it is based on a false God. It is based on a God who failed. That is not the God of the Bible. It is not the God that deserves worship. We need to help people understand that. Because the one true God deserves all of their praise and all of their life. And additionally, as we're going to talk about next week, while this, what we've talked about, doesn't have anything to do with the second coming of Jesus, we ourselves need to prepare for the second coming of Jesus. Because He will come again. As we will talk about next week, there will be no signs like there were for the coming of the destruction of the temple. And that's why we need to be ready and stay ready today until He does finally come, whenever that day is. It may be tonight. It may be 2,000 years later. We need to be ready nonetheless. And we need to also help others, humbly help others prepare for that by teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because again, so many people, they do not know the gospel of Jesus Christ. They think they do, just like they think they know what's going on in these passages. They think they know about the gospel of Jesus Christ. But when it comes down to it, what they believe and what Scripture teaches, very different. We need to help them understand, and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is my prayer for us, that we take this lesson and we use it for our betterment of ourselves, for the betterment of this church, for the betterment of those around us, and all to the glory of God. Go ahead and get out your songbooks now. Open them up to the Song of Invitation. Can you believe originally I had both of these lessons in one? Yeah, that would have been nuts. You don't have to agree with that, Mike. But my friends, we close with the invitation. That maybe you're here tonight and you realize you're not ready for the second coming of Jesus, whatever that may be. Get ready today. Get ready today. If you're looking for a sign, this is your sign. Get ready for the coming of Jesus today. If you don't know what that is, then let's sit down and let's talk about it. If you know what that is and you don't know, you know how to get ready for it and you just haven't done it yet, what are you waiting for? Make your life right with God tonight. If you want help with that, let's get together and let's talk about that. But if you're here and you're ready to make your life right with God, you're ready to get ready for the judgment day, then please obey the gospel. Obey the gospel tonight. If you're ready to do that, please come to the front right now as we stand and as we sing.
I gave my life